The classified memorandum arrived at the War Department in Washington at 9:47 a.m. on September 15, 1940. Major General James E. Cheney, the Special Army Observer in London, had transmitted his most recent intelligence assessment through secure channels. Secretary of War Henry Stimson opened the envelope, expecting another routine briefing on British defensive operations. What he read instead forced him to summon Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall at once. German air formations, numbering approximately 1,500 aircraft, had carried out coordinated assaults on London that day. RAF Fighter Command scrambled every squadron it could muster in response. British pilots reported the destruction of 185 enemy aircraft. Luftwaffe bombing accuracy had been seriously degraded by sustained fighter opposition. Despite severe civilian losses, British morale remained resilient. RAF still functional. German air superiority not attained. Stimson set the report aside and looked across his desk at Marshall. Around them, wall maps depicted a world rapidly shrinking beneath Axis expansion. Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France all had fallen within months. Poland crushed. The Soviet Union aligned with Germany through the Nazi-Soviet pact. Japan advancing relentlessly across China. Only Britain remained a lone island bastion resisting the darkness spreading over Europe. Before we continue, take a moment to comment where you are watching from and subscribe for more stories like this. Marshall spoke first, his voice heavy with conclusions he had been calculating for months. If the RAF collapses, Britain will fall within weeks. If Britain falls, a hostile power will dominate the Atlantic approaches. The Royal Navy could fall under German control, creating a direct threat to the Western Hemisphere that current American military strength could not counter. This was not exaggeration. It was arithmetic, cold, unforgiving arithmetic that American war planners had been grappling with since France's collapse 3 months earlier. France's defeat in June 1940 shattered every assumption underlying American defense planning. The French army, widely regarded as the strongest military force in the world, had disintegrated in just 6 weeks. The Maginot Line, the supposedly impregnable defensive system that had consumed billions of francs, had simply been bypassed. German mechanized warfare integrating tanks, aircraft, and mobile infantry into coordinated blitzkrieg operations had proven unstoppable to American observers across the Atlantic. The implications were horrifying. General Marshall had assumed the post of Army Chief of Staff in September 1939, inheriting a force ranked 18th globally in size, roughly comparable to Portugal's army. The United States Army numbered just 174,000 men, while Germany fielded more than 3 million. American troops trained with wooden rifles due to a shortage of real weapons. Artillery dated back to World War I. Tanks were experimental novelties. The Army Air Corps possessed fewer than 800 combat aircraft, most of them obsolete. The U.S. Navy was stronger, but its strategic focus remained the Pacific and Japan, not the Atlantic and Germany. Most American battleships were stationed at Pearl Harbor. Atlantic forces were minimal. Doctrine emphasized hemispheric defense rather than projecting power across an ocean controlled by hostile forces. Britain's survival was not merely important to American security, it was essential. British strategists understood this, American planners understood it as well. What remained uncertain was whether the American public understood it, or whether they would accept it in time. Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, drafted a memorandum in late 1940 known as Plan Dog. He outlined 4 possible strategic paths for American involvement should war come. His conclusion was unequivocal: if Britain fell, the United States would face enemies on both the Atlantic and Pacific fronts simultaneously, with hostile bases potentially extending into Canada, Greenland, Iceland, the Caribbean, and South America. American naval strength would be divided between 2 oceans, unable to concentrate decisive power in either. The Western Hemisphere itself could become a battlefield. Stimson, who had previously served as Secretary of War under President Taft and Secretary of State under President Hoover, brought a historical perspective that made the crisis even more disturbing. At 72, he had been recalled to service by President Roosevelt in July 1940. He had seen empires rise and collapse. He understood how quickly what seemed permanent could disappear. He knew American isolation was not a policy, it was a temporary privilege granted by geography, rapidly eroded by modern technology. In his diary entry dated September 15, 1940, the day that would later be known as Battle of Britain Day, Stimson wrote, "The situation is more critical than the public realizes. If the RAF fails to contain the Luftwaffe, Britain cannot survive. If Britain falls, we will face the most desperate strategic position in our nation's history. Our security rests entirely on British pilots we cannot reinforce, flying aircraft we did not build, defending an island we cannot protect." American military observers had been stationed in Britain since early 1940, sending back detailed reports on German capabilities and British defensive preparations.
What they witnessed fundamentally reshaped American strategic thinking.
Colonel Raymond W. Bliss of the Army Medical Corps arrived during the early phase of the Battle of Britain, assigned to study British civil defense and medical response to aerial bombardment. His reports described scenes that seemed almost unreal: entire city blocks reduced to rubble by high explosive bombs, fires consuming neighborhoods while civilians sheltered in underground stations, hospitals operating through air raids as bombs fell nearby. The British Emergency Medical Service was handling casualties on a scale that exceeded American planning assumptions by orders of magnitude. Yet Bliss also reported something unexpected: British resolve. Civilians clawed through debris to rescue trapped neighbors.
Fire brigades fought infernos while raids continued overhead. Factory workers maintained production schedules despite ongoing bombing.
The predicted collapse of civilian morale under sustained aerial attack never occurred.
Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, dispatched to London as special naval observer, provided evaluations that directly influenced American naval planning. His young aide, Lieutenant Donald J. MacDonald, witnessed German bombing firsthand.
In later oral history, MacDonald recalled, "We'd be in discussions with British Admiralty officials about convoy routes and U-boat threats, and the building would shake from bombs falling 3 streets away. The British would scarcely interrupt the conversation. They would say, 'Sorry about that. Where were we?' and resume planning as though nothing had happened."
Gormley's reports emphasized British vulnerability, but also British competence.
The Royal Navy still dominated the waters surrounding Britain. British radar, a revolutionary technology, was providing early warning of German air raids.
RAF Fighter Command, though outnumbered, was inflicting losses on the Luftwaffe that could not be sustained.
Most importantly, Britain remained determined to fight. Major General Cheney, the Special Army Observer, forwarded technical assessments that would profoundly shape American military development. He reported on British radar systems, air defense coordination, aircraft effectiveness, and the evolving tactics of modern aerial warfare.
His observations of RAF operations against the Luftwaffe provided the first real-world data on how air power functioned in prolonged combat. American aircraft design, anti-aircraft doctrine, and air defense planning would all be influenced by Cheney's reports from London.
Beyond technical details, Cheney also supplied strategic insight in a classified memorandum to Marshall dated August 28, 1940. He wrote, "British determination to resist exceeds previous American estimates by a significant margin. RAF Fighter Command remains operationally effective despite heavy losses. Luftwaffe casualties continue to mount. German strategy appears to lack a clear objective beyond attrition.
Britain will not surrender."
The question is whether Britain can endure. While British pilots fought in the skies above England, American military leaders were engaged in a different struggle in Washington, a political battle to prepare the nation for a war most Americans desperately wanted to avoid. The isolationist movement remained powerful throughout 1940. Influential figures such as aviator Charles Lindbergh, former President Herbert Hoover, and Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy argued forcefully that America should remain disengaged from Europe's war. To millions of Americans, their logic seemed reasonable: the Atlantic Ocean was 3,000 mi wide.
Britain and France had gone to war in 1914, dragging America in 3 years, later at tremendous cost.
20 years of peace had followed the Treaty of Versailles.
Why repeat that mistake? Senator David Walsh of Massachusetts, chairman of the Naval Affairs Committee, opposed sending weapons to Britain with stark logic.
"I do not want our forces deprived of one gun or one bomb or one ship which can aid that American boy whom you and I may someday have to draft." Lindbergh, perhaps the most influential isolationist voice, called Roosevelt's June 1940 speech pledging aid to Britain
defense hysteria.
He argued that America faced no genuine threat of invasion and
that involvement in European wars would only bring disaster. The America First Committee, formed in
September 1940, attracted hundreds of thousands of members and held massive rallies opposing intervention.
Their central argument was simple:
Europe's wars were Europe's problem.
America
should focus on defending the Western Hemisphere, not entangling itself in conflicts across the Atlantic.
But
Roosevelt, Stimson, and Marshall understood what public opinion polls and isolationist rhetoric could not change.
Geography had stopped protecting America. German long-range bombers were in development.
Submarine warfare had
proven its effectiveness. If Britain fell, German forces would control bases
from Norway to France to potentially Africa and South America.
The Atlantic
would become a highway for Axis power projection, not a barrier protecting American security.
Stimson found the isolationist arguments infuriating.
In cabinet meetings throughout the fall of 1940, he pressed Roosevelt to move faster, do more, prepare the nation for
inevitable war.
In his diary, he vented frustrations he couldn't express publicly.
The isolationists live in a
fantasy world where oceans remain barriers and enemies respect neutrality. They don't understand that if Britain falls, we will face enemies on both coasts with a military force 120th the
size we need.
By the time they realize their error, it will be too late to correct it.
Marshall took a more
measured approach, but reached the same conclusion. In meetings with congressional leaders, he laid out the
mathematics of defense without Britain.
American ground forces would require years to reach necessary strength. American industrial production, still recovering from depression, would need massive expansion.
American casualties in a defensive war fought in the Western Hemisphere would be catastrophic.
We cannot allow Britain to fall, he told the Senate Military Affairs Committee in closed session.
We do not have the strength to fight the war that would follow. Roosevelt walked a tightrope between interventionists and isolationists with masterful political skill. He could not lead public opinion.
He had to shape it gradually.
The 1940 presidential election loomed.
Roosevelt was seeking an unprecedented third term, breaking the tradition established by
George Washington.
His opponent, Wendell Willkie, supported aid to Britain, but
attacked Roosevelt for bypassing Congress. Any move too aggressive toward war could cost Roosevelt the election,
and with it, any chance of preparing America for conflict.
The massive German air raids on September 15 represented Hitler's final major attempt to break
the RAF and clear the way for Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain.
Approximately 1,500 German
aircraft, bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance planes struck London and
surrounding areas in coordinated waves. RAF Fighter Command responded with everything it had. 56 squadrons scrambled, Hurricane and Spitfire. Fighters intercepted German formations across southern England.
The air battles lasted from morning through afternoon,
with dogfights visible from the ground as contrails marked the sky. By evening,
British and German commanders were both assessing results. The British claimed 185 German aircraft destroyed, a number that would later be revised down to 56, though German losses were still significant.
More importantly, the
Luftwaffe had failed to achieve its objective.
The RAF remained operational. British airfields continued functioning. Fighter Command could still contest German air superiority. For Hitler and
his generals, September 15 marked the point where Operation Sea Lion became impossible.
The Luftwaffe had not destroyed the RAF.
Without air superiority, a seaborne invasion would face the full might of the Royal Navy without air cover, a scenario that promised catastrophic German losses.
On September 17, Hitler postponed the invasion indefinitely. On October 12, he formally cancelled it.
The Battle of Britain had been won,
not decisively, not conclusively, but sufficiently. Britain would endure.
News of the September 15 raids reached Washington
the same day through multiple channels. Cheney's official military assessment arrived first. Press reports followed,
describing the massive air battles and British claims of German losses. By evening, Roosevelt, Stimson, and
Marshall were conferring on the implications. The immediate reaction was relief. Britain had held. The RAF remained operational.
Invasion was averted, but the larger strategic picture remained desperate.
The Battle of Britain had been defensive.
It prevented defeat but achieved no victory.
Germany still controlled continental Europe. The Luftwaffe would continue bombing British cities through what would become known as the Blitz. U-boat were sinking merchant ships faster than Britain could replace them. North Africa was stalemated. The Far East
remained vulnerable to Japan.
Britain had survived September 15.
Whether Britain could survive the war remained an open question.
Roosevelt's response to Britain's position crystallized in his Arsenal of Democracy fireside chat on December 29, 1940.
The speech represented the
culmination of months of careful preparation of American public opinion. He opened by defining the threat. Never Before since Jamestown and Plymouth Rock has our American civilization been in such danger as now.
He described how Nazi Germany had conquered nation after nation through a combination of fifth-column subversion and military force. He explained how the Western Hemisphere would face direct threat if Britain fell. Then he made his case.
We must be the great arsenal of democracy for us. This is an emergency as serious as war itself.
We must apply ourselves to our task with the same resolution, the same sense of urgency, the same spirit of patriotism and sacrifice as we would show were we at war.
The speech acknowledged reality without declaring war.
It committed America to British support without sending troops. It prepared the nation psychologically for conflict while maintaining the fiction of neutrality.
Politically, it was masterful. Strategically, it was essential. Stimson and Marshall had been working on
the practical implementation of Arsenal of Democracy for months.
In September
1940, Roosevelt had negotiated the destroyers for bases deal, exchanging 50 aging American destroyers for 99-year leases on British bases in the Caribbean and Newfoundland.
The deal provided
Britain with desperately needed escort vessels while giving America forward bases for hemisphere defense. Stimson had used his Republican credentials to neutralize political opposition. He personally contacted Wendell Willkie, the Republican presidential nominee, to ensure the deal wouldn't become a
campaign issue.
Willkie's muted criticism, calling the deal regrettable but not opposing it, allowed Roosevelt to proceed without triggering a major political crisis. But destroyers were only the beginning. Britain needed aircraft, tanks, artillery, ammunition, food, fuel, everything required to sustain a nation at war. American industry would have to produce for two nations simultaneously,
building up U.S. forces while supplying Britain's war effort.
The Lend-Lease Act, introduced in January 1941 and passed in March, provided the legal framework.
It authorized the president to sell, transfer title to, exchange, lease, lend, or otherwise dispose of war material to any nation whose defense was deemed vital to U.S. security. In practice, it meant American industry would produce weapons that Britain would use with payment deferred until after the war.
Stimson testified before Congress 5 times in support of Lend-Lease. In his diary, he called it an
economic declaration of war against Hitler. Marshall provided military assessments showing how British survival protected American security. Admiral Stark explained how British naval power guarded Atlantic approaches that American forces couldn't adequately defend.
The legislation passed with
significant bipartisan support, though isolationists fought bitterly. Lindbergh testified against it. The America First Committee organized opposition. But by
March 1941, the political equation had shifted.
The Battle of Britain had demonstrated British determination. German bombing of civilians had turned public opinion. The American public
wasn't ready for war, but they were ready to support those fighting.
On the day Lend-Lease became law,
Stimson ordered the first supplies shipped to Britain.
American factories began the transformation that would make
the United States the arsenal of democracy in fact as well as rhetoric. While political battles raged over aid to Britain, Stimson and Marshall were fighting equally important battles over
American military preparedness.
In June 1940, as France collapsed, Congress had been debating a $28 million appropriation for radar stations to detect Japanese aircraft off the West Coast. Roosevelt's budget office had cut $10 million from the request.
Marshall
confronted the president directly.
"You have got to do something and you've got to do it today."
Roosevelt restored the
full appropriation.
The incident reflected the broader challenge.
America's military was unprepared for modern warfare on any scale.
Building the force needed to defend American interests, let alone project power,
would require unprecedented mobilization.
The Selective Training and Service Act,
passed in September 1940, established America's first PCE draft. Stimson and Marshall had pushed the legislation over fierce isolationist opposition. The law authorized drafting 900,000 men for 1 year of service. It was a start, but only a start. Germany had 3 million men under arms. The Soviet Union had 5 million. Japan had 2 million. Training facilities didn't exist to handle even 900,000 draftees. Weapons to equip them was still in production. Doctrine for employing them was being written. The
United States was trying to build a modern military while simultaneously defining what a modern military should
look like. Marshall organized the effort with systematic efficiency. He
identified officers with talent and promoted them rapidly, breaking the seniority system that had oified the
officer corps. He ruthlessly dismissed officers who couldn't adapt to modern warfare.
He pushed for realistic training that prepared soldiers for actual combat, not parade ground maneuvers.
Industrial mobilization proved equally challenging.
American factories were still recovering from depression.
Converting civilian
production to military output required capital investment, retooling, and workforce expansion.
But it also required deciding what to produce. Should America build more tanks or more aircraft? What type of tanks? What type of aircraft? Which technologies should receive priority?
British combat experience provided invaluable data.
Reports from American observers in Britain described which weapons worked and which didn't. What armor was effective? What aircraft design succeeded? How modern warfare actually functioned versus how pre-war theory
predicted it would function.
The Two-Ocean Navy Act passed in June 1940 authorized an 11% expansion of the Navy, approximately 200 additional ships.
Admiral Stark requested 70% more beyond that.
Congress approved it within a month. The United States was building toward naval supremacy, but construction would take years. Ships authorized in 1940 wouldn't enter service until 1943. Or 1944.
American aircraft production expanded rapidly.
In 1939, American
factories had built fewer than 6,000 military aircraft. By 1941, production exceeded 26,000.
By 1944, it would reach 96,000 annually.
But in fall 1940, with France fallen and Britain under siege, those future numbers were projections, not reality. Stimson pushed constantly for faster
preparation. In April 1941, after Roosevelt authorized U.S. Navy patrols in
the Western Atlantic to warn of U-boat, Stimson cheered but pressed for more.
He wanted the Navy authorized to escort British convoys. He wanted American troops pre-positioned in Britain. He wanted the nation on a war footing, even if war wasn't formally declared. Roosevelt moved more cautiously, always aware of political constraints, but he was moving. By fall 1941, American destroyers were escorting British convoys. American troops were garrisoning Iceland. American industry
was producing for British needs. The United States wasn't at war, but it was no longer neutral either.
Private conversations between Stimson, Marshall, and their British counterparts revealed the depth of Anglo-American strategic cooperation developing behind the scenes. In early 1941, British and
American military staff began the ABC-1 conversations, secret negotiations to
coordinate strategy should America enter the war. The resulting agreement established the Europe First principle. If America fought Germany and Japan simultaneously, primary effort would focus on defeating Germany while holding defensively against Japan in the Pacific. The reasoning was strategic and practical. Germany was the greater threat.
Germany's industrial capacity exceeded Japan's.
Germany's military technology was more advanced. Germany's potential to threaten American security directly was far greater. And Germany was already
at war with Britain, providing an established ally with forces in the field.
Marshall advocated for concentrating American strength rather than dispersing it.
He told Roosevelt in September 1941, "Our broad concept of encircling Germany and closing in on her step by step is the only practical way of wearing down her war potential.
Large ground forces will be required. We estimate 215 divisions to defeat Germany. 215 divisions, each division numbering 15,000 men, over 3 million. American soldiers would need to be trained, equipped, transported across the Atlantic and supplied for sustained operations in Europe.
The logistics alone were staggering. The political will required seemed impossible to
achieve without American entry into the war. But if Britain fell, those calculations became irrelevant. Without British bases, American forces couldn't strike it. Occupied Europe. Without the Royal Navy, Atlantic supply lines couldn't be protected.
Without British intelligence, the coda reeking at
Bletchley Park that would prove so crucial, German operations would remain unpredictable.
Without British survival, American strategy had no foundation.
In May 1941, German battleship Bismarck sorted into the Atlantic, threatening British convoy routes. British forces hunted it relentlessly until naval gunfire and torpedoes sent it to the bottom. The effort required had been enormous.
Multiple battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers coordinating across hundreds of miles of
ocean.
Britain had succeeded, but the effort revealed how strained British
naval power had become.
Churchill wrote to Roosevelt describing the situation. The next 6 or 7 months bring the relative battleship strength in home waters to a smaller margin than is
satisfactory. Bismarck and Tir-Pits will be in service. We must maintain concentration never previously necessary in this war. American military planners understood the implication. If the Royal Navy was stretched thin protecting British waters, who would protect Atlantic convoy routes? Who would secure approaches to the Western Hemisphere?
The answer was obvious but unspoken.
American naval power would have to fill gaps that British forces couldn't cover. Neutrality was becoming fiction. America was sliding into war without declaring it.
What Roosevelt, Stimson, and Marshall could not publicly acknowledge was how deeply American security depended on factors outside American
control. British survival depended on Churchill's determination, and Churchill had become Prime Minister only in May 1940 after Neville Chamberlain's government fell.
If Lord Halifax had become Prime Minister instead, Britain
might have negotiated peace with Germany. The entire strategic foundation of American defense planning depended on decisions made by British politicians Americans couldn't influence. British survival also depended on Hitler's strategic mistakes.
His decision to switch from bombing RAF airfields to
bombing London had given fighter command time to recover.
His decision to invade
the Soviet Union in June 1941 had diverted German strength eastward. His declaration of war on America after Pearl Harbor had unified American public opinion. Every Hitler blunder bought time for America to prepare.
British survival depended on technological advantage radar that had been developed
independently of American efforts. It depended on codaring that American intelligence wasn't yet conducting at similar scale.
It depended on the channel 21 miles of water that made German
invasion logistically complex enough to prevent.
American planners knew their security rested on factors they didn't
control.
It was a humbling and terrifying realization.
The United States wasn't master of its fate. It was dependent on an ally's courage, an enemy's errors, and geographic accidents. This understanding drove the
urgency in Stimson's diary entries, Marshall's testimony before Congress, and Roosevelt's fireside chats.
America needed to build strength sufficient to control its own security.
But building that strength required time, and time
required Britain holding. Everything came back to Britain.
The Japanese attack on December 7, 1941 resolved
the political crisis. Isolationism collapsed overnight. Congress declared war with near unanimous votes. The America First Committee disbanded.
Lindbergh, who had opposed intervention so vigorously, volunteered for military service, though Roosevelt never accepted
him.
But Pearl Harbor created new problems even as it solved old ones. America now fought on two fronts simultaneously, exactly the nightmare scenario that strategic planners had sought to prevent. Public opinion, traumatized by the Japanese attack, demanded retribution against Japan.
Congressional leaders questioned whether Europe should remain the primary focus. Stimson advocated for Europe first with his characteristic bluntness.
In early 1942, as American forces fell back in the Philippines and Japanese troops advanced through Southeast Asia, he told Roosevelt, our first major operation must be a resounding success.
Germany must remain the priority. The risk of dispersing forces across too many theaters is strategic defeat everywhere.
Marshall supported Stimson with military reasoning. Germany remained the greater threat. Defeating Japan required controlling immense Pacific distances, a multi-year campaign. Defeating Germany required concentrating forces in Europe, where allies existed and supply lines were shorter. Churchill crossed the Atlantic for the Arcadia Conference in December 1941, arriving just weeks after Pearl Harbor. In meetings with Roosevelt and American military leaders, he pressed for British strategic concepts, peripheral operations in North Africa and the Mediterranean before a direct assault on occupied France.
Stimson and Marshall resisted. They favored direct operations, a cross-channel invasion as soon as American strength permitted.
They viewed Mediterranean campaigns as distractions that would postpone decisive action. Yet British combat experience and strategic arguments gradually influenced American planning. By mid-1942, American leaders had accepted that a direct invasion of France would have to wait until 1943 or 1944. With North Africa coming first.
These debates revealed how profoundly the Battle of Britain had shaped subsequent strategy.
Had Britain fallen in 1940, American planning would have focused entirely on hemisphere defense. There would have been no discussion of invading North Africa or France because no forward bases would exist.
There would have been no Royal Navy safeguarding Atlantic convoys.
There would have been no Bletchley Park supplying intelligence on German operations. American military power, vast industrial capacity, immense manpower reserves, and technological innovation would have been directed solely toward defending approaches to the Western Hemisphere against enemies operating from forward bases Britain's fall would have provided. The Battle of Britain had averted that catastrophe. British pilots, flying Hurricanes and Spitfires, had defended not only their nation but American security interests that the United States could not yet protect. Public statements throughout late 1940 and 1941 praised British courage with careful phrasing to maintain political support for aid without triggering isolationist backlash. In private correspondence and classified memoranda, leaders acknowledged a grimmer truth: American survival as a free nation had depended on RAF success in a battle Americans were not yet fighting. Strategic planning for victory relied on British forces holding positions American troops could not yet defend. The future of American security depended on decisions being made by British politicians and pilots more than 3,000 miles away. A diary entry by Stimson from November 1941, written 1 month before Pearl Harbor, captured this realization clearly. We have constructed a strategy that presumes British survival.
We have mobilized an industrial base that produces to meet British requirements. We have assembled a military force designed to operate from British bases. Had Britain failed in September 1940, none of this would have been achievable. Marshall rarely wrote with the emotional intensity of Stimson, yet his operational planning demonstrated the same understanding. Every American strategic concept for defeating Germany began with Britain secured as a base of operations.
Every logistical framework assumed British ports receiving American material. Every projected timeline relied on British forces engaging and occupying German divisions. Britain was not simply an ally. Britain was the cornerstone. Admiral Stark articulated this reality most directly in his Plan Dog memorandum. Without British dominance of the Atlantic, American security would require unprecedented defensive deployments. With British cooperation, American power could be projected offensively, allowing enemies to be defeated before they could threaten the Western Hemisphere. The Battle of Britain determined which of these paths would become reality. Britain's survival allowed American strategy to remain offensive, focused on destroying adversaries far from American shores. Britain's collapse would have forced the United States into a defensive posture on its own territory, a far more dangerous and uncertain course. Military leaders in 1940 and 1941 understood this completely. In public, they could not express it openly without undermining confidence in American strength, nor could they emphasize it politically without reinforcing isolationist arguments. Yet in classified meetings, private correspondence, and strategic planning documents, they confronted the truth. By December 1941, when the United States formally entered the war, the strategic foundation was already in place. Europe First had become official policy. Anglo-American military cooperation was operating at unprecedented levels. Industrial mobilization was underway. Political resolve to fight had been forged. None of this would have been possible had the RAF failed in September 1940. American planners had followed the Battle of Britain with anxiety carefully concealed behind diplomatic restraint. They understood that British pilots were defending American interests that the United States was not yet capable of defending itself. They recognized that American security rested entirely on battles in which Americans were not participating. Stimson's words to Roosevelt in April 1942, as American and British forces prepared for operations in North Africa, acknowledged this obligation. The British held when holding seemed impossible. They fought when surrender appeared rational. They endured bombing, blockade, and isolation while the United States built the strength it now brought to the alliance. Whatever disagreements might arise over strategy, he wrote, victory planning had been possible only because Britain stood alone in 1940. The Battle of Britain preserved Britain, but it also preserved American strategy, American security, and potentially American independence. Senior command understood this throughout 1940 and 1941, even if public opinion did not. Classified memoranda, private diaries, and strategic assessments all revealed the same conclusion. Had Britain fallen, America would have confronted enemies it could not defeat, with inadequate forces, fighting a defensive war on its own soil without allies or forward bases. The RAF's victory over the Luftwaffe in the autumn of 1940 prevented that disaster. Britain's survival granted the United States time to mobilize. British bases provided platforms from which American forces could strike. British resolve gave planners confidence that their ally would endure long enough for American power to shape the outcome. When Churchill addressed the House of Commons after the Battle of Britain, he immortalized the pilots with words that would echo through history. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. American leaders reading classified reports in Washington understood the truth went even further.
Britain did not merely owe its survival to those few. America owed its strategic position, its offensive capability, and its pathway to victory.
In September 1940, British pilots fighting over England determined not only Britain's fate, but America's strategic future.
The American High Command fully grasped this reality.
Publicly, they could not say it, but privately, they never forgot.